What's going on, guys? I'm CFBKings, and welcome back to another episode of the CFBKings Show. Really appreciate you tuning in here on November 21st, 2024. We're about to head into Week 13 of the college football season, and it's just wild how quickly it's flown by yet again. On the bright side, though, we're just about at the peak of the regular season here. Week 13 has massive implications all over the place, and it's really do or die time. If you're outside the CFP field, time to make a move into that top 12. If you're inside the CFP field, time to solidify your case and get to a conference title game. If you're a 5-win team, it's time to lock in a bowl spot, and if you're third or fourth in conference standings, time's running out to get to that conference title game. The implications of Week 13 were amplified on Tuesday night by some of the rankings put out by the College Football Playoff Committee, and as usual, I wanted to start today's episode with a little rankings reaction. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see the top 25 there, and there was a ton of stuff in this edition of the committee's rankings that just doesn't really make much sense. First off, I can't, but in a much more real sense, very much can, believe that they kept Missouri ranked number 23 following their loss on Saturday night to South Carolina. They were 23rd, lost, and are still 23rd. There's no other explanation for this ranking other than that the committee wants to keep them ranked at all costs so they can give teams like Alabama and Texas A&M and even South Carolina another ranked win. And more importantly, Missouri's there so that teams like Kansas State, Pitt, Duke, Syracuse are not. Because if Kansas State was ranked, that's a big resume boost for BYU. Can't have that. If 7-3 Pitt or 7-3 Duke, God forbid both, were ranked, that would be an enormous resume boost for SMU and partially for Miami. SMU beat both of them, Miami beat Duke. And if Syracuse was ranked, that would be a big boost for Miami, who plays them in 2 weeks, and could potentially earn a ranked win there. Instead, though, shockingly, Missouri doesn't move after a loss, and the SEC resumes get strengthened by keeping a ranked win. Missouri has a 34-point loss to Alabama, a 31-point loss to Texas A&M, a loss to South Carolina. They have one of the weakest non-conference schedules in the FBS. I've mentioned it a couple times, but their 4 non-conference opponents were Murray State, Buffalo, UMass, and BC, and they have 0 ranked wins. They are 0-3 against ranked opponents. And if you combine all that together, that's somehow worthy of being a ranked team. The same can be said for Illinois. The Illini are 0-3 against bowl-eligible teams, 0-3 against any team that is currently eligible to make a bowl game. They have 0 ranked wins. They lost by 29 to Oregon. Their best win is 5-5 Nebraska. They beat 1-9 Purdue, the worst team in the Power 4, by 1 point in overtime at home. There is 0 explanation for Illinois getting that 25 spot, other than the obvious one, which that it gives Penn State a ranked win. And just like that, the committee can then point to that metric in comparison to other teams, where it gives Penn State the edge over 1-loss Miami, it gives them the edge over 1-loss Texas, who they're somehow ranked behind anyway for some reason, but I don't get that either. But it gives them the edge over 1-loss BYU, it gives them the edge over 1-loss SMU. And I tweeted a lot about this on Tuesday night, and a bunch of people were commenting like, yeah, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but it's number 23 and number 25. Who cares? Those teams are out of the playoff. It doesn't really matter. Those spots do matter, though, because who number 23 and number 25 are, and if those teams continue to move up over the next couple weeks, that can influence who number 5 through number 12 are when the committee decides the CFP field. So Missouri and Illinois are ranked with a combined total of 0 ranked wins, and 7-3 Kansas State and 7-3 Syracuse aren't, with a combined total of 3 ranked wins between those two. Missouri and Illinois have 0, Kansas State has 2 over number 16 Colorado and number 22 Lane, and Syracuse has 1 on the road over number 24 UNLV. Duke, like I mentioned before, is another team that can be thrown into this conversation as well. They're 7-3, they don't have a ranked win, but their losses are by 1 point to number 13 SMU in overtime. They lost by 22 to number 8 Miami. 22 is significantly better than 31, 34, and 29, like the losses that Missouri and Illinois have. They're 1-0 against the Big Ten. They have as many wins over bowl-eligible teams as Missouri and Illinois combined. They're unranked, though. Another just egregious ranking on Tuesday was the fact that Alabama jumped Miami for beating FCS Mercer. Alabama played an FCS team last week. Miami had a bye week. Alabama is now ranked higher than Miami. I mean, that in itself should just invalidate the rest of the top 25. What could they have possibly seen Alabama do against the Mercer Bears that made them change their minds and say, yeah, we think they're better than Miami now? And people get on Miami for losing to Georgia Tech, while Alabama has a loss to Vanderbilt, who lost to 2-7 Georgia State, and then Alabama also lost again to Tennessee. So if two-loss Alabama was behind Miami before, how does beating Mercer help them jump the Canes now? Alabama has a loss that's worse than Miami's is to Georgia Tech, and then a second loss added on to that to their rival Tennessee on the road. So naturally, we'll then hear about how difficult Alabama's schedule is, how tough the grind of the SEC is. Miami didn't find it that tough when they beat Florida by 24 in the Swamp. And that same Florida team murdered Kentucky, who beat Ole Miss. They beat LSU, who also beat Ole Miss. They took Tennessee to overtime in Neyland, who beat Alabama. And they would have beaten Georgia if every player in their first and second strings didn't get hurt in that game. But Miami dominated that Florida team by 24 points on the road. And to tie it back into my original point with Missouri, the biggest argument that I heard to justify two-loss Alabama being ahead of one-loss Miami was, wait for it, their number of ranked wins, because Alabama has 3 and Miami has 0. One of those ranked wins is Missouri, who's keeping a team like Duke or Syracuse from being ranked. That's why it matters. Lastly, one of the bigger shakeups was that BYU dropped 8 spots from number 6 to number 14, because losses only matter if you play outside the SEC and the Big Ten. But with them dropping that far, they're now behind number 12 Boise State. So with the highest ranked team in the Mountain West being ahead of the highest ranked team in the Big 12, Boise State would currently be the 4th highest ranked conference champion, and they were depicted in the bracket as getting a first round bye week in the college football playoff. That very likely will not stand unless there is severe chaos in the Big 12 and the champion ends up having like 3 losses or something. But with BYU being 14 and Colorado at 16, Arizona State at 21, Iowa State at 22, all 4 of those teams are ranked higher than UNLV, who Boise State would be playing in the Mountain West title, most likely. I think Colorado State is also still up for that. But there's just not really enough there to solidify Boise State's resume when the Big 12 champion is probably going to have 2 more ranked wins over the next 3 weeks. All right, that's about it for Rankings Reaction. Let me know what you think in the comments down below of the CFP Top 25, of my opinion on it. I was very active on Twitter on Tuesday night. I had a bunch of immediate disagreements and shared them over there while watching the show. So make sure you're following at CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram, especially on Twitter for the conversation on Tuesday nights. Let's get into some Week 13 previews. The main event is in Columbus, Ohio, as undefeated number 5 Indiana travels to number 2 Ohio State for a long-awaited showdown. We finally get to see what the Hoosiers are made of and how they'll perform against a seemingly very high-caliber team. Ohio State is a 13.5-point favorite. The over-under is 51.5. Implied score of 33-19 Buckeyes. So Vegas clearly thinks that Ohio State has a significant edge here. 13.5 in Columbus means probably like 10.5 at a neutral site. So especially with home field advantage, they believe that Ohio State has a really good chance to win this game. As we've seen, especially last week with 20-point favorite Louisville losing at Stanford, point spreads really don't mean much, though. There's been so much talk about Indiana, their schedule, what the committee should do with them if they lose, all that stuff. A couple of ESPN guys on the Rankings Show on Tuesday even went as far as to say that Indiana should just sit their starting quarterback, Curtis Rourke, have him not play in this game to avoid potential injury, and more or less mail it in because they have no shot anyway. There's been so much talk like that about Indiana over the past month and a half, ever since this Ohio State game really caught people's eye as the first time that the Hoosiers would get a major test. But today I wanted to talk about how Indiana might be able to win this game. First off, Ohio State has played a ton of teams who simply struggle to score the football. They've played a lot of teams who just don't get into field goal range much, who don't get into the end zone much. Ohio State has played one team in the top 30 of scoring offense. That one team is Oregon, whose offense is ranked 27th, who they lost to. Here are some of the offensive rankings of their other opponents. Iowa is 56th, and Iowa is one of the better offenses that they've played. Put that into perspective. The Iowa Hawkeyes are one of the better offenses that Ohio State has faced. Outside of them at 56, they've played Nebraska, who's 100th, Akron, who's 120th, Michigan State, who's 121st, Northwestern, who's 126th, and Purdue, who's 129th. They've played 5 offenses ranked in the 100s. Penn State's offense is 33rd, and the Buckeyes beat them by 7. So they've faced 2 top 40 offenses, lost to one of them, and beat the other by 7 points. Indiana is number 2 in points per game. They average 43.9 points per game, trailing only Cam Ward and the Miami Hurricanes. So this will be the first time that Ohio State's seen a top 5, top 10, top 15, top 20, even top 25 offense. Indiana is 25 spots ahead of Oregon in points per game, and they play in the same conference. And I know the Hoosiers have played a lot of the bottom half of that conference, but outside of Oregon, Indiana, Penn State, and Ohio State, the rest of the Big Ten is largely the same. And then on the other side of the ball, Indiana is 7th in points per game allowed, right next to Penn State, who held Ohio State to their lowest point total of the season. Now, you can of course say the same thing the other way around, with Ohio State's offense and Ohio State's defense being the best that Indiana will have faced by far. But everyone knows that, though, and that's part of the reason that they're saying that Indiana is going to get killed and why they're a 14-point underdog. Everyone knows Indiana's schedule hasn't been all that hard, but you also have to include in that statement what the Hoosiers have done to those teams. Their average score is 43.9 to 13.8. If you round up those numbers, their average score is 44 to 14. They're averaging a 30-point win, and we're in week 13 of the season. They beat UCLA by 29. That's more than Penn State and Oregon beat UCLA by. They beat Nebraska by 49. Ohio State beat Nebraska by 4. They beat Michigan State by 37. Ohio State beat Michigan State by 31. They beat Northwestern by 17. They beat Maryland by 14. They beat their FCS opponent by 74. Alabama beating Mercer was apparently a big deal for the committee, so Indiana's 77-3 win over Western Illinois might carry some weight as well. They've had one close call all season, and that was a 5-point win over 5-5 Michigan at home. You know who else almost lost to a 5-5 team at home? Ohio State, when they needed a goal line stand to beat 5-5 Nebraska by 4 in Columbus, the same Nebraska team that Indiana beat by 49. And my last point in the case for Indiana is head coach Curt Cignetti. Coach Sig has faced one AP-ranked opponent in his 3 years as a head coach in the FBS. That was number 23 Coastal Carolina in 2022 when he was at James Madison. His JMU team beat 9-1 number 23 Coastal Carolina 47-7. He is 1-0 against AP-ranked opponents, and that win is by 40. I'm not saying Ohio State is Coastal Carolina or that Indiana's going to win by 40. What I am saying, though, is that Sig can get his team ready for big-time games against quality opponents. Prediction-wise, I think Indiana has a decent shot. That 13.5-point spread feels a little large. I have a strong feeling that Sig and Indiana have heard everyone calling them overrated garbage all year. I've heard several notable talking heads compare them to a group of 5 team. I bet word got around the program that ESPN analysts think they should sit their starting quarterback Curtis Rourke because they're going to lose anyway and should try to avoid injury. And while all that's been happening, the Hoosiers have just gone week to week, averaging a 30-point victory. I'll take the Hoosiers to cover that 13.5-point spread, and I really wouldn't be surprised if they went on the road and defeated the number 2 Buckeyes. In another matchup with massive college football playoff implications, number 14 BYU travels to number 21 Arizona State, and despite their respective rankings, the Cougars are an underdog. Arizona State is a 3-point favorite. The over-under is 48.5, implied score of 26-23 Sun Devils. I talked about it last week when I picked Arizona State to beat K-State, but the Sun Devils are playing really, really well right now and have a seriously feasible path to the Big 12 championship and the college football playoff. BYU's coming off the loss to Kansas, their only loss of the season, and despite that loss, they stayed at first in the Big 12 standings and still, of course, control their own destiny for the Big 12 title in CFP. But in order to get there, this is a must-win game against Arizona State. The most obvious key to this game is simply how will BYU match up and be able to contain Cam Scatterbo. The running back for ASU is 3rd in the nation in all-purpose yards per game. He averages 169 total yards each time he steps on the field, behind just Ashton Jeanty at Boise State and North Carolina's Omarion Hampton. And then quarterback Sam Leavitt has been really solid as well for ASU. In their last 3 games, he's averaged just about 250 passing yards per game and has 9 touchdowns and 0 interceptions in that span, 3 passing touchdowns in each game. The Cougars' defense hasn't exactly been the best against the run this season. They're 58th in the FBS, allowing an average of about 140 rushing yards per game. They do, however, have a top 25 scoring defense, allowing just under 20 points per game. BYU's had a few close calls lately, and then the loss, of course, to Kansas. Arizona State has a ton of momentum. Their last 3 games are a 21-point win over Oklahoma State, a narrow win over UCF, but that was without Scatterbo, who we know is a huge part of everything they do offensively, and they still scored 35 in that game. And then the 10-point road win over number 16 Kansas State. The Sun Devils get this game at home. I think that environment will be really charged up. This is their first major game at home in quite some time, and especially their first home game with college football playoff implications since, I guess, 2014 when they had that top 10 matchup with Notre Dame. But I'll take Kenny Dillingham and Arizona State to come away with the win. Another enormous matchup. There's really 3 do-or-die games for the playoff this week. The loser of Indiana-OSU probably won't be eliminated, but they will be out of the Big Ten championship race, so that definitely affects college football playoff seeding and everything. But number 19 Army's taking on number 6 Notre Dame in a neutral site game at Yankee Stadium. Notre Dame is a 14.5-point favorite. The over-under is 44.5, implied score of 30-15, Fighting Irish. Similar to Indiana-Ohio State, we have one of the final remaining undefeated teams in the FBS getting their first major challenge of the season. They're away from home, and they're 2-possession underdogs. Indiana and Army have actually played wildly similar seasons so far this year. They're both undefeated. They're both 7-0 in conference play. They're both having one of their best seasons in program history, if not the best in Indiana's case. They both won 9 games by double digits. They both beat a G5 team from Florida as part of their non-conference schedule. They both had their quarterback get injured for 1 game. Indiana has the second-ranked scoring offense. Army has the second-ranked scoring defense. Both teams had their closest game of the season in the last game that they played, and both teams had their second bye week last week. It's pretty crazy how many similarities they have, and there's quite a few others too, but those are just some of the more obvious ones. I don't have quite as much confidence in Army's ability to be able to pull off the win, though, like I do with Indiana, but there definitely is still a path, and this game might be a lot closer than that 14-point spread. The biggest concern for the Black Knights, and everybody's gotten on Indiana's strength of schedule, but Army's is ranked 133rd in the FBS. There are 134 FBS teams. The only team who's played an easier strength of schedule than Army is Liberty. There is just such a massive upgrade in the caliber of team that Army's going to be playing, from who they have been playing to who they're going to be seeing in the Fighting Irish. But against that schedule, Army has looked dominant, just like Indiana. They've held 5 opponents to single digits and 8 of their 9 opponents to 14 points or less. So they've done what they're supposed to do to that caliber of schedule. I mentioned it a second ago, but they have the second best defense in the country in points per game allowed. They give up just 10.3 points per game. Notre Dame's defense is right there with them, actually right behind them at third, allowing just 11.4 points per game. One thing that makes me think that Army might be able to stay in this game for a while, though, is how Notre Dame has performed against other defenses like that of what they're going to be seeing from the Black Knights. So Army's defense is second in the FBS in points per game allowed. Northern Illinois' defense is 18th in the FBS. They allowed just 18.6 points per game. They held the Irish to 14 points and beat them in South Bend. Texas A&M's defense is 22nd, right behind NIU's, allowing right around the same number, 19.4 points per game. Notre Dame was tied with the Aggies 13-13 with 2 minutes left in that game before tacking on a late 10. And then even against Miami of Ohio, who has the 13th best scoring defense, allowing just 17.8 points per game, Notre Dame scored 28 in that one, and that was 14-3, pretty late into the third quarter. Outside of those 3, which are their 3 lowest scoring games of the season, these are some of the other defenses that Notre Dame has faced. Navy, who's 61st, Louisville, 73rd, Virginia, 86th, Florida State, 100th, Stanford, 120th, Purdue, 131st. And against Louisville and Virginia, 73rd and 86th, Notre Dame scored 31 and 35 on them, so nothing super crazy there. It's not anything profound, but against the 3 best defenses that they faced, they scored 28 or less every time, and 2 of those opponents were group of 5, like Army is, including the one responsible for Notre Dame's only loss. Then every other team that they faced just simply hasn't been all that great on the defensive side of the ball. With that being said, I really do like the way that Notre Dame's been playing lately. Something to include with those Texas A&M, NIU, and Miami of Ohio games is that they were all in the first month of the season, and they were working in Riley Leonard, the transfer quarterback from Duke, in during all those games. And over their most recent 3 games, they've won by 37, 49, and 21. But that does just circle right back to, well, those teams are all really pretty rough on the defensive side of the ball. So prediction-wise, I do give Army a little bit more respect than I think most of the public is at the moment. I think they can cover that 14-point spread because of how low scoring the game will probably be, but I think Notre Dame will get the win. Number 9 Ole Miss goes on the road to Florida into the Swamp, where the Gators just beat number 22 LSU last week. They'll try to play spoiler again and knock Ole Miss out of SEC title and college football playoff contention. The Rebels are 10.5 point favorites. The over-under is 55.5. Implied score of 33-23 Ole Miss. This game is at noon on ABC, the last home game for Florida, so that place should be rocking on Saturday afternoon. Florida is really strange in terms of how close they've been to having a completely different season. They got smoked by Miami right out of the gate, but they changed up a couple things defensively after that, had some major playmakers emerge, especially at running back and wide receiver, and then when DJ Lagway's been in at quarterback, they're 3-0 in games that he's started and finished. I've said it a bunch of times on the show, but they really easily could have beaten Tennessee and Neyland earlier in the year. It took them playing about as bad as possible in the first half when they had opportunities to get points and just didn't capitalize on any of them. They, in all likelihood, probably would have beaten Georgia had Lagway not gone out with the hamstring injury. They dominated Kentucky by 28. They beat LSU by 11. They beat Mississippi State by 17. They beat UCF by 11. And I really wouldn't be surprised if they kept this close with Ole Miss. The biggest key to this one will be how each team can protect their quarterback. Ole Miss has a ferocious defensive front, and DJ Lagway's been great at quarterback for the Gators, but he's also a true freshman, and this will be the toughest unit that he's seen by far. Then on the other side, the Gators were all over Garrett Nussmeier last week, and LSU came into the season with what was supposed to be the best offensive line in the country, and with what really has been one of the best in the country so far this season. But coming into last week, LSU had given up 6 sacks all season. Florida sacked Nussmeier 7 times on Saturday alone. Florida sacked him more times than USC, Nicholls, South Carolina, UCLA, South Alabama, Ole Miss, Arkansas, Texas A&M, and Alabama did combined. So Florida has an impressive defensive front of their own, and while Jackson Dart has those games where he's thrown for 500 yards and 6 touchdowns like he did against Arkansas, he's also had games where he threw for 284, 1 touchdown, 1 interception against LSU, 199, a touchdown and a pick against Georgia, 285, 0 touchdowns against South Carolina. The Gators are going to have to force a performance like that out of Dart. If Florida's going to be able to pull off the upset, they need to not only give Lagway enough time to find someone downfield or design some plays to roll him out if the hamstring will allow, but they also need guys like Shamar James and Tyreek Sapp, TJ Searcy, Caleb Banks to get to Dart and shorten Ole Miss's drives. I can really see this game going either way. Ole Miss is coming off a bye week, and Florida's coming off the emotional win over rival LSU. Ole Miss is trying to keep their CFP hopes alive. Florida's trying to secure a bowl bid. Overall, both teams have a lot of momentum going into Week 13, and it should be a great game. Number 16 Colorado travels to Kansas, and the Big 12 and CFP hopeful Buffaloes are going on the road to one of the hottest teams in the country. I talked about it a lot in the Week 12 recap episode, but Kansas, despite being 4-6, really hasn't been that bad all year. They have, I think, 5 losses by 1 possession, and they're very close to having a completely different year. Both of the non-conference FBS teams on their schedule, UNLV and Illinois of all teams, are both currently ranked. Arizona State ended up being way better than expected. They lost by 2 points at Kansas State, and they blew a 10-point lead in the fourth quarter at West Virginia. I'm not sure how many people remember this or even noticed it at the time, but the Jayhawks came into the season favored by the ESPN FPI to win the Big 12 championship. They actually had the highest percentage of any team in the conference to win the Big 12 title, and they've been playing like that caliber of team over the last couple weeks. Colorado is a 3-point favorite. The over-under is 59.5, implied score of 31-28 Buffaloes. One matchup to watch in this one is Kansas running back Devin Neal against that Colorado defense, who's currently 57th in rushing yards per game allowed. Neal is one of the best running backs in Kansas history. He surpassed 4,000 career rushing yards last week against BYU. He had 2 rushing touchdowns against number 17 Iowa State, 2 rushing touchdowns against number 6 BYU, and he has at least 1 rushing touchdown in their last 7 consecutive games. So watching that battle between him and Colorado's defense, as well as quarterback Jalen Daniels and his scrambling ability, he has 4 rushing touchdowns in the Jayhawks' last 5 games. That matchup will be very critical to this game. I have no real lean here at the moment. Can definitely see it going either way. Very tight point spread and should be an entertaining matchup. A couple other notable games. Number 15 Texas A&M goes on the road to Jordan-Hare to take on Auburn, where they're surprisingly just barely favored. Texas A&M is a 2.5 point favorite. The over-under is 46.5. Implied score of 25-22 Aggies. This is a 7:30 p.m. Eastern kickoff on ESPN. Night game at Jordan-Hare, final one there of the season, and should be an electric atmosphere. The Tigers are 4-6, looking to stay alive for a bowl game, and the 8-2 Aggies are trying to stay alive for the SEC championship game and a college football playoff bid. This point spread really makes me lean toward Auburn because this is a team that lost to Cal at home. They lost by 10 to Arkansas at home. They lost to Oklahoma at home. They lost by 10 to Vanderbilt at home. And Vegas thinks this game against number 15 Texas A&M will be decided by about a field goal. Very intriguing. Then we also have number 22 Iowa State on the road at Utah. The Cyclones still technically have a path to the Big 12 championship game and therefore the college football playoff. A ton to play for in that one. Number 7 Alabama at Oklahoma, 7:30 p.m. Eastern on ABC. Night game on the road. Who knows, maybe the Sooners could finally get one this year. Pitt at Louisville, both eliminated from the ACC race, but could be a fun game. And then 7-3 Syracuse hosts 7-3 UConn. Yes, 7-3 UConn. I made a post about it on Instagram and Twitter last week, but the Huskies are having one of their best seasons in quite some time and now get a really interesting challenge on the road against the Orange. Number 13 SMU travels to Virginia. That's a single-digit spread, right around 9.5, depending on where you look. Then number 4 Penn State travels to Minnesota. The Nittany Lions lost their last trip there in 2019 when they were coincidentally also ranked number 4. Something to watch there. And last but certainly not least, ladies and gentlemen, the Pac-12 championship game is this week as the conference's 2 members, Washington State and Oregon State, face off in Corvallis. This game actually would have been really intriguing if Washington State was still ranked and still had an outside shot at the CFP, but nonetheless, still a good matchup between 2 solid programs. I just hate everything that happened to them with conference realignment. I'm glad the Pac-12 is staying alive and getting some more conference members in a couple years, but for now we get to see who will claim the title as the 2024 Pac-12 champion. All right, let's get into some picks. Last week we went 7-4. That brings the overall record to 73-45 on the year, hitting right around 62.8%. As usual, if you don't wager any money on these games, I'd advise you to just keep it that way. There is far more losing than there is winning, and fortunately, things have been on the winning side here so far this year, but that definitely doesn't mean that it'll stay that way. Don't believe all the contrived nonsense that's out there, a lot of fake winners, a lot of made-up stuff on social media, just designed to entice. And if you maybe don't do it yourself, but like the premise of looking at point spreads and all that, stick around for a few minutes while I go through my picks, and if you aren't with it at all, feel free to check out now. First up, I've got Ohio State quarterback Will Howard, longest rush over 9.5 yards. So we just need him to have any run of 10-plus yards. These are his longest runs over the last 5 games. 12 yards, 11 yards, 10 yards, 12 yards, 12 yards. So he is very consistent. He's basically good for like 1 run of first down yardage per game, and I think we can get that against the Hoosiers. Then I have Virginia plus 9.5 against number 13 SMU. I had the Cavaliers plus 22.5 last week against Notre Dame, and they covered that. And I like them in this one for one big reason. Since Tony Elliott took over in 2022, Virginia's played 5 ranked ACC opponents. 4 of those games have been decided by 1 possession, and they've outright won 2 of them. The only one that wasn't decided by 1 possession was a 17-point loss on the road to Clemson, Elliott's former team, earlier this year. In those 5 games, though, listen to these outcomes. They were a 7.5-point underdog to number 17 North Carolina in 2022. They lost that game by 3. They were a 23.5-point underdog to number 10 North Carolina in 2023. Outright won that game by 4. 23.5-point underdog, won it by 4. They were a 20.5-point underdog to number 11 Louisville last year, lost that game by 7. And they led by 7 in the fourth quarter. Louisville scored 17 points in the final quarter to win that one. They were a 21-point underdog to number 10 Clemson earlier this year. They lost that game by 17. And they were a 7.5-point underdog to number 18 Pitt 2 weeks ago, outright won by 5. If you didn't pick up on the pattern, that is 5-0 against the spread under Tony Elliott when facing a ranked ACC opponent. 5-0. And for good measure, like I mentioned a second ago, they covered last week against number 8 Notre Dame too. I like Virginia covering plus 9.5 against the number 13 Mustangs. I also have Boston College quarterback Grayson James under 236.5 passing yards against North Carolina. This will be James' just 3rd game with significant playing time, and he's their starter now since Thomas Castellanos is done and entered the portal. Ever since North Carolina just got embarrassed by James Madison, they've been a completely different team defensively specifically in terms of how they've contained quarterbacks. These are the passing totals that the Tar Heels have allowed over the last 6 games. 172, 123, 156, 127, 381, and 209. So an obvious outlier there, that 381 was Eli Holstein at Pitt, but in their last 4 consecutive games, they haven't allowed a 200-yard passer, and in 5 of the last 6 held a QB to under 210 yards. With the way that they've been playing and James making just his 3rd start of the season, I like that under 236.5 number. And lastly, I have Cam Ward under 0.5 interceptions against Wake Forest. I actually hit on this same prop with Cade Klubnik against Wake Forest earlier in the year, where he didn't throw one. Ward has just 1 interception in the Canes' last 4 games. He's coming off a bye week. He's had 2 weeks to study the Wake Forest defense. He has just 6 interceptions on the year, and I think 3 of those are on crossbody throws to the middle of the field that he just shouldn't have even thought about throwing. But outside of those, he's usually very sharp. I like Cam Ward under 0.5 interceptions on Saturday against the Demon Deacons. That's going to wrap up this episode of the CFB Kings Show. Really appreciate you making it all the way to the end. It's hard to believe we're in the second to last week of the regular season already, but it's always a ton of fun, and Week 13 slate is going to be a blast. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube, follow if you're listening on Spotify, and definitely check out @CFBKings on Twitter and Instagram for all things college football. Thank you so much for watching. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and take care.